Hello, and welcome to Equipping Staff for Success, training colleagues to engage volunteers. I am Beth Steinhorn, and I am a proud partner of Better Impact. Happy to be here to present this session on a very timely topic. As president of VQ Volunteer Strategies, I work with organizations across the US and Canada and sometimes beyond to help organizations of all different types tap volunteer talent to increase impact. And as such, I am really pleased to be presenting this in partnership with Better Impact. This is a re-recording of a webinar that was originally hosted live on June 19th, 2024. And I'd like to welcome you all to this recorded version of this particular presentation. For years, training staff has been a priority, but we all know that in recent years, given all the recent events, some of which I'll be sharing in more detail, this idea of needing to train our colleagues to be effective and efficient in engaging volunteers is even more pressing than ever. We've been hearing a lot about staff changes, which means that you likely are either new in your role or working with colleagues who are relatively new in terms of their work at your organization, regardless of their title, and potentially very new in terms of engaging volunteers. With this landscape, it was all the more impressive to me when I was working with an organization known as PCAS, Pasco County Animal Services in Pasco County, Florida, and learned about their robust and varied training program for colleagues across the whole Humane Society, the whole Animal Services Agency. And that's why I'd like to open this with a little bit of background on PCAS and how they train staff to effectively and strategically engage volunteers. In Pasco County, they have a large number of trainings for staff, including this one that I have some highlights from on the screen. This is about volunteer engagement in general at Pasco County. You can see that through this training, Sarah Sukram, their Director of Volunteer Services, shares some quick facts about their team. She shares this interesting and I think really lovely org chart, which is not so much about hierarchy, but more about the service areas and how volunteers are integrated into all areas of service that Pasco County Animal Services offers, from customer service to veterinary services, shelter operations, community partnerships and programs, and of course, field services as well. While she goes through all of this, including even discussing some of those very common questions from colleagues who work with volunteers. How do you have difficult conversations or handle tough situations with volunteers? In which case, she shares in great detail steps you can take, what you can do, and maybe what you should not do when dealing with tough situations. But what impressed me so much is that in addition to these 1 hour or 2 hour webinars or workshops that Sarah offers, equipping staff for success is not limited to just these webinars or workshops. Sarah integrates training of her colleagues into every communication and nearly every interaction. It is part of the way that they do business at PCAS. Take a look at this letter, this email that Sarah sent out a little over a year ago to the department heads to share last month's results on their onboarding scoring and other volunteer satisfaction surveys. But in addition to sharing that feedback from volunteers, she takes the opportunity to highlight a few things to keep in mind. For example, she notes a few things to consider as we head into April, which is also National Volunteer Appreciation Week, at least here in the US. She says, what does a first impression look like? Are we meeting the volunteer in the lobby? In the volunteer room? Do they feel that we are ready and expecting them? What terminology are we using? Our terms, and then she lists a whole lot of abbreviations, acronyms, she reminds them, are all a different language. Let's be sure we're keeping in mind what we're saying and how it's being received. And she goes on to give additional tips. It's that sort of integrated coaching that really helps not just train staff, but shift the culture. In fact, it was during this part of our conversation when their director of animal services stepped in and said, it's because of this sort of support that our volunteers went from a workload to a workforce. And I told Mike, the director of animal services, that I was going to use that quote because I felt it captures exactly what we as leaders of volunteers should be shooting to, what we should be aiming for. We need to train, the goal of training colleagues to engage volunteers should really be to help them understand how to tap into volunteer talent in a way that they view volunteers as a workforce, not just another thing on their plate that they need to do. That's what he meant when he said our volunteers went from a workload to a workforce. So what brought you to this topic today? I often ask when it comes to training staff on volunteer engagement, where do you fall on this spectrum from regularly training other staff to occasionally training them, maybe just doing some informal training, or maybe just seeking to find ways to integrate training in any way more than you currently are? And what I usually find is that regardless of the answers that anyone gives, and I usually have answers all across the board, wherever you are in this little multiple choice question, there are opportunities for you to not necessarily do more. In some cases, you might need to do more or benefit from doing more, but there's lots of opportunities to do things differently and a little more holistically. And that's what I hope you take away from today's session. So how can you move a little further along the spectrum from maybe no training to very robust integrated training for greater impact and greater volunteer-driven mission fulfillment at your organization? I like to break it down into 4 steps: making the case, identifying the need, designing for success, and then implementing it and following up. So often we are tempted, or we succumb to the temptation to simply dive into workshop development. Oh, we need some training. Let me plan a 20-minute recorded video, or let me plan a 75-minute workshop. But that isn't always the best place to start. We need to start by first making the case for training staff. In some cases, maybe you don't have to, maybe you have an open organization, but more often than not, we need to explain the benefits and why folks should invest the time in learning more about strategic engagement. Then identify the needs, what really is needed to be addressed. And then with that information, design in a way that is going to be most effective, most welcomed, and most long-lasting. And then, of course, we need to do it and follow up. So let's take each of these 4 building blocks one by one. We'll start with making the case. When I think about making the case for training staff in volunteer engagement, I think it's very helpful to acknowledge what are the barriers to training staff in volunteer engagement. First and foremost, we hear often it's time. People don't have time, or they think they don't have time, or they're not willing to make the time for they themselves or for their staff to learn about and practice effective volunteer engagement. Another piece, which often goes hand in hand with the time issue, is a limited understanding of the benefits. So one of the things we're going to talk about is ways that you can articulate the benefits of training staff in volunteer engagement. And often it's simply just inertia. Let's face it, if we've always done things a certain way, it takes extra energy and understanding and willingness to shift from that status quo. So knowing that these are some of the barriers, and you may have some others as well that are unique to your organization, let's talk about different pathways that can help you kind of clear those barriers out of the way, or turn those barriers from obstacles into hurdles that we can overcome. We can look to external data that demonstrates those benefits and that return on investment in terms of time. I think it's also helpful to talk about the internal needs, so we'll talk about that. You need to be able to paint a clear visual of the benefits of engaging volunteers and understanding how to do that effectively. And ultimately, this is about you embracing your role as not just a manager of volunteers who might recruit and or supervise some volunteers, but as an internal consultant, as a coach, as someone who can access resources on behalf of your colleagues, whether they're caseworkers, in the case of PCAS, Pasco County Animal Services, vet techs, they might be food pantry managers, they might be nurses in a hospital or hospice where you might be engaging volunteers, box office managers in a theater, whatever your colleagues' titles are, you need to embrace your role not as someone who runs a fulfillment center of, oh, there's a request for volunteers, I'm going to fulfill that request, but instead as a partner, as a resource, as a source of talent, a talent scout, and just as an HR manager would, as a partner who can provide support and expertise to build your colleagues' competence in effectively engaging and supporting volunteers. So let's start with some of these case-making pathways. We'll start with external data. And on each of these slides, you'll see some of the sources. So if you want to learn more, you can look into these particular reports. One of the most recent reports, though, that I like to share is one called The State of Volunteer Engagement, Insights from Nonprofit Leaders and Funders, that was funded and commissioned by the Initiative for Strategic Volunteer Engagement and implemented by the Do Good Institute. It came out in late 2022, published in early 2023. And unsurprisingly, what we learned was across the field, particularly given recent events since COVID and other events since 2020, economic challenges, demand for nonprofit and public sector services has really gone up, while staff and resources have remained flat or gone down. So here we are with a pinch between demand and limited capacity or decreased capacity to meet that demand. And I see that data, and of course, as someone who's passionate about volunteer engagement, I think the answer is volunteers. Let's engage volunteers to help build our capacity to close this gap between demand and our capacity to deliver on it. The problem is that one of the biggest, or there are a couple problems. One is one of the biggest challenges that nonprofit leaders have identified is recruitment. And we also know that has been and continues to be tremendous turnover in terms of staff. So we not only have limited staff, but we have lost institutional history and memory around how to engage volunteers because we often have new staff. Maybe that new staff is you. Maybe you've only been in your position for a few months or just a few years, or maybe you're working with many colleagues who are new to their roles. In 2022, we did some work with a large museum in the Northeast of the United States, and in the 4 or 5 months between our doing an assessment and writing the report and analyzing and providing insights and recommendations on how to enhance their volunteer engagement as they were bringing volunteers back into on-site service, in that period of just 4 or 5 months, the volunteer engagement professional's supervisor left. That person was promoted to take on that role. And then the division director to whom she now reported, who was hired when we started working with them, had left. And the story goes on. And in just that 5-month period, counting others who had turned over, Our young, who started out as junior staff person with on that team of talent and culture, had been there 2 years and was the most senior person and the most long tenured person within that department. So, who among you is new? Are you new in your organization? Are you working with new folks? Take a moment and step back and think about what that means for the culture of volunteer engagement at your organization, and what might that mean for needs in terms of training, and share that information with leadership, because that turnover means that you have curators, collections managers in the case of a museum, or theater managers, or as I said, food pantry or pastoral care folks. You have colleagues who, naturalists, who may be very skilled at their particular job, but haven't yet worked with volunteers before. And so you might need to be starting at a one-on-one level on how to do that, and even defining what your role in volunteer services or in the volunteer department, if you have a department, what that even looks like for your colleagues. Another key piece of data is, unsurprisingly, when you have a lot of turnover, with a lot of overworked, under-resourced, and disengaged or burned out staff members. And so another pathway is to share the benefits that engaging volunteers can provide to help as an antidote to burnout. This isn't about replacing staff with volunteers. This is about engaging volunteers to build capacity beyond that which staff alone can deliver. So that's another pathway to talk about, folks are burned out. Let's look into volunteers as a workforce, not as a workload, because they can really help as an antidote to this challenge of feeling like there's lack of time and feeling burned out. And this is not just a nice platitude. This is research-driven, research-backed information. Organizations that embrace volunteer engagement strategically and as a central strategy to support all areas of operations are known in the United States as a service enterprise. Some are accredited as service enterprises. And we know from research 15 years ago and continue to be supported by ongoing research that these organizations that embrace volunteer engagement strategically outperform those that don't. They outperform it in terms of being nimble and adaptable and capable of going to scale. They leverage resources, including financial resources, more effectively. And we also know what characteristics are associated with operating in this way. And I won't go through all 12 of these here, but the one that I want to point out, and these foundational ones on the bottom of the screen here, best practices in volunteer engagement, training is one of the top 6 most vital characteristics for an organization to embrace. But it's not just training of volunteers. It's training of staff and volunteers as well. Training the volunteers to be successful, but also equipping the staff who supervise and support volunteers to do so effectively and strategically. And that is part of operating as a service enterprise, as a strategic volunteer engagement organization, and reaping all of those benefits that research shows. So those are some of the external data points that you can tap to help make the case why training your colleagues to effectively engage volunteers can be beneficial and is important to set the time aside. And it's up to you to share that data. Then you can also be looking internally. What are you seeing? Are there gaps in knowledge and practice? What are you hearing? Are staff and volunteers asking different questions that could be addressed more globally by a training? And what are you doing? Are there new practices, policies, or tools that are ready to roll out? Think about those needs. We'll get into them a little more deeply soon. And another piece of making the case is really about embracing your role, not just as a manager or coordinator of volunteers or whatever your title is. And it could be fund development manager who also manages volunteers. It could be food pantry manager who also manages volunteers. But you need to really embrace your role as a strategic leader. This is about thinking about with whom you have good relationships at the organization, which colleagues are doing well in terms of engaging volunteers, and how can you tap them to be champions for engagement and for training, and even to train their peers. We want to acknowledge that one of the most challenging lots of a volunteer engagement professional is that you need to influence without authority. You probably don't supervise all of the people who engage volunteers at your organization. So how can you tap into your powers of influence, even if you don't have authority over these folks? And how can you position yourself as a partner to your colleagues to help them, not as a compliance manager, but as a partner? We have a toolkit that's free and downloadable from our website, Internal Partnering to Enhance Volunteer Engagement. And that's a toolkit that is that walks through all three of those things that I just talked about, helps you identify and map out your relationships, gives some tips on influencing without authority, the powers of persuasion, and also helps you position yourself as a partner, particularly in training. How does Sarah Sukram do that at Pasco County Animal Services? She makes the case internally in very formal and in very informal ways. She says, first of all, you need to just assume that your colleagues need training and volunteer engagement. She says they always need volunteer engagement training. You have to assume that they need it. So when I asked, how do you do that? She said, well, in the director's presentations, she talks to directors in regards to full-time equivalents. So she works to find, as you see on the screen here, she finds the currency of the different folks that she needs to get on board and get support from. So when she's talking with directors, division directors, she has a special way of talking about the benefits of engaging volunteers, and she does it in terms of full-time equivalents and staffing. She says, in the minute that the directors started seeing the savings or expanded capacity, leadership started changing their mindset. She says she can preach it all day long, but if a director sees that 15 hours a week of an individual vet technician's time is saved by having a volunteer prepare the surgery packs for veterinary surgery, and the vet techs could do other things with their time, they're on board. So my question to you is, what's the currency that your colleagues value, and how can you frame training their staff in volunteer engagement in a way that they see as valuable, that will help them buy in? Once you have buy-in, then it's time to identify need. And these can also happen in parallel. What are the real needs that your colleagues have in terms of training? So let's tease apart these questions a little more deeply. What are you seeing? Are there staff partners and volunteers who lead the way? Are there those who struggle or resist? And if so, what is it that's causing them to struggle or resist in terms of creating effective partnerships between staff and volunteers? What are you hearing? What are the questions or requests for assistance that arise? Staff or volunteers who might be requesting support or advice, sharing feedback about interactions or onboarding or communications or performance. I can say that nearly every organization we've worked with on issues of training staff around volunteer engagement, they don't need to do a big survey. Some do it anyway and learn additional things, but most volunteer engagement professionals don't need to do a big survey to find out the number one topic that their colleagues struggle with. And usually that is how to give effective feedback and constructive feedback to volunteers, how to have difficult conversations. Yours may be different, but that's the one that I hear most commonly. What are you doing? Again, are there policies, tools, or resources that you're ready to roll out? Do you want to be able to train your colleagues who are managing volunteers to better leverage technology like the Better Impact platform so that they can be supporting volunteers in their area to log hours, to approve schedules themselves, et cetera? What are those things that again, need to be rolled out or expanded across the organization? And what what are you learning from staff surveys, from volunteer surveys, from volunteer exit interviews, from sitting in on meetings? We'll go back to our example at Pasco County Animal Services, and Sarah added, I sit on the leadership team, which meets every other Wednesday. That's where supervisors invite me to come and talk about issues that are challenging to them, or they ask questions about issues that are challenging to them or their teams during those meetings. And she said, if I hear something, then I ask them to roll out their calendars and I invite myself to their team meetings so that I can talk about it with the larger group. So again, how can you identify and surface issues that might need some support, training, formal or informal? Which then leads to another part of identifying your internal needs. What are you already doing? This isn't about fixing anything that's broken. It's about building on the foundations that you already have. So are you already offering training to staff? Is it through an online platform? Do you have all hands meetings where folks meet and sometimes someone gives a 20-minute training as part of that? This might not be about inventing all sorts of new things. It could be about tweaking and expanding what's already offered. There's an organization that went through service enterprise training and certification a number of years ago in San Diego, California. They are Jewish Family Services of San Diego. They had what they called JFS University. It was their internal talent management training program for staff. And they had programs that were required, kind of like a college, and ones that were electives. And a big win for them was simply shifting the Volunteer Engagement 101 from an elective to a required course. So every person on staff, regardless of their role, whether it was managing senior services or housing assistance or refugee resettlement or food pantry, whatever it was, every single staff person, even accounting, needed to take at some point during their first 2 years there, this Volunteer Management 101 course. So what's being offered, and are there gaps where you need to develop new types of training? So you're identifying needs. The next step is to begin to design for success. Often we start with the design, but hopefully you've taken the time to make the case and identify the needs, and then can begin to map out how you're going to design the training. The first step is to identify your big idea and then select the format, then develop it and set expectations. So let's walk through each of these 4 little steps within the big step of designing for success. What's the big idea? That's the question for your design phase. What is your big idea? What is your key priority or takeaway? If you had complete success from your 30-minute presentation during an all-staff meeting, or your 10-minute online video, or your 30 minutes on another department's meeting, whatever it is, what is your priority takeaway? If they could take one thing away, and that would be success for you. Is it understanding something new? Is it changing a behavior? Is it complying with a new policy or something different? Here's a couple examples just to really make this concrete for you. Maybe it's simply having everyone walk away thinking, I can engage a skilled volunteer, and that would be a good thing. Posting a volunteer opportunity is really easy. Maybe it's behavioral interviewing will help me find a good candidate for the volunteer needs I have in my program. Or using the volunteer management software will make my job easier. Maybe you have volunteers that help with a crisis line and staff a crisis line. That self-scheduling option could be really, really vital. And if I just take the time to understand how to leverage Better Impact or any other tech options, then it's really going to benefit everyone. So I have to practice what I preach. Here's my big idea for you in sitting through this presentation. My big idea is that training colleagues will benefit the whole organization. And as a secondary one, my little idea that I hope you leave with is that I can do so in ways beyond the traditional 1-hour workshop. So how can we diversify the ways that we traditionally deliver trainings. And that's to think beyond just these traditional 1-hour workshops. Not that there's anything wrong with the 1-hour workshop, but when you have staff who are thinking that they don't have enough time and that there's not value there, it's best to integrate this work into other areas of communication. And there are so many different options. Is volunteer engagement incorporated into your new employee orientation? If not, it should be. This is one of the number one things that I see shifting with organizations that I work with, whether they go for service enterprise sort of accreditation or they're doing strategic plans for volunteer engagement, whatever it is, integrating volunteer engagement, even if for only 10 minutes into new employee orientations, sets the stage for every employee. Then volunteers are vital to our organization. And I, whether I'm in accounting or finance or facilities management or program delivery, will be encountering volunteers and may even be able to benefit from engaging volunteers is a great way to set the stage. How about onboarding of new staff? So not just the general staff orientations, but onboarding within each department. Are volunteers even introduced to new staff as part of their onboarding? Yes, formal workshops or brown bag lunches are a great way, but they don't have to be long, which is why I'm going to take some time today to share a trend we've been seeing that we call mini training. So I'll talk about that more in a moment. There's in-the-moment training or coaching, which I'll also talk about. But then there's ongoing communications, right? Like we saw with Sarah and her emails that are going out. In addition to that, what are the existing professional development communications and programs, whether they're workshops like JFS University or employee newsletters that go out regularly? How can you integrate tips and tools about engaging and supporting volunteers into that? Are there also other trainings that are being offered? Like maybe if you're in a disaster relief organization, maybe you do trainings for staff on compassion fatigue. What about incorporating volunteers into those trainings? So we're seeing the combination of staff and volunteers working together. That itself becomes a training and an enrichment opportunity to nurture that partnership between staff and volunteers. I've delivered many trainings for staff and volunteer leaders who lead teams of volunteers on how to give feedback, constructive feedback to volunteers, and seeing staff and volunteers working together to address that, or staff and volunteer leaders, is really, really productive. There's also job aids, which I'll share in a moment. And of course, you could put together a whole library of on-demand videos as well, or resources of existing tools, even if you didn't develop them yourself. So when we do these traditional webinars or workshops, and this is from a different Florida animal shelter, Peggy Adams Animal Rescue League, it's also helpful to, you can utilize these traditional slide decks and yes, incorporate a little humor as they have here, but you can also incorporate trainings into many other communications and job aids. This is a tool that was based on work that we did with American National Red Cross. And it's just a checklist to help staff check in new volunteers and onboard new volunteers. What do the staff need to do to prepare? What are the things they should talk about when they're meeting with the volunteer? And what's the follow-up? So demystify that process, make it as consistent as possible by creating materials like this that can be resources for staff. It doesn't have to be an hour-long training. It could be a 10-minute introduction to this tool and then a resource that they can access. History Colorado, I'm based in Denver, Colorado. That's our state history agency. It includes our 9 different museums across the state, plus our state archaeologist's office. And around the building of their flagship museum, they have behind the scenes where staff are located, they have a variety of job aids like this nice, beautifully designed quick look for staff about how to request and screen and place a volunteer in their department if they have an idea for something that a volunteer could help with. It's a great, attractive tool that they can use. Simple poster, really. I think when we were working with them, it was next to the copy machine or the printer. But it doesn't always have to be beautifully designed like that lovely quick look for staff from History Colorado. Here's one from Star of the Sea Foundation in the Florida Keys. It's just a simple volunteer orientation checklist with a debrief. And also, and this is my favorite, it's called the New Program Checklist. This is a tool that they developed. This is a human resource kind of safety net services organization that has a checklist of, so you're a staff member, you have an idea for a new program. Here are the questions you should be thinking about. Not only is it really meeting a true community need, whom will it serve, how will this program fulfill the needs of clients, but you can see in bold, they ask right out there, how can we incorporate volunteers into this program? Are any existing volunteers a good fit? Which staff or volunteers will help support those volunteers? And how will we train staff and volunteers to carry it out? What a great training opportunity to, through this checklist, begin to train staff to think about volunteers as part of program design, not as an afterthought. And you can do that with a simple checklist like this. So hopefully you've made your case, you've identified some needs, and you've honed in on one or more different formats for the program. Now it's time to actually develop the training. And the example I want to use, or a couple different examples I want to use, are if you're going to be developing a curriculum of some sort, whether it's a webinar, recorded video, or something else, you can leverage curriculum training materials that you might be using for training volunteers as well. We have this tool that's a volunteer training plan. It's a template that helps people think through how to train volunteers. You can deploy that. It's just adult learning, whether they're paid staff or volunteers. You can help deploy this or leverage this to deploy towards designing curriculum for staff as well. And it's simple questions like, what are the vital skills or knowledge? What's the key content? And what's the best way to deliver it? So excerpting a few things from that template, couple key questions to think about, kind of summarizing it in just 4 questions. What information is vital to communicate? What types of activities will help your participants understand and integrate the information into their own mindset and their work practices? Is it discussion questions? Is it role play? Maybe they're going to draft the answers to a certain tool or resource. Maybe it's walking through scenarios. What are those interactive components that could help move this from simply information in their head to, again, the way that they do business? One of the questions I love the most that I learned from my mentor was, what gaps in knowledge will impede success? Let me unpack that for just a moment. It's so tempting to train on everything. The old drink, oh, I've got them in the room, I have a captive audience. Let me just get all this information out there. And just as we sometimes do with volunteers, we might with staff use that proverbial drinking from a fire hose scenario, which is not effective learning techniques. So what you really want to step back and ask is, what gaps in knowledge would impede a staff member from succeeding in supporting a volunteer? What is it if they didn't know, then they're really going to have a problem? And then the rest you can do as ongoing training or have some additional information around. I started my career in museums, and I think about when we were training volunteers on our new prehistoric journey exhibition. And some curators wanted the volunteers to know every single example of a prehistoric rhinoceros that was in this one diorama or this one case of fossils. And really, what we knew as educators was the volunteers really only needed to know one, because their job was to engage visitors in looking. And so what's that? And they could do that with just knowing the background of one of those fossils in that case. What's the parallel for staff? Do they need to know how to recognize all volunteers in there and provide recognition, or do they need to know just what their responsibility is for providing informal acknowledgement and support to volunteers on a daily basis? And later they can learn more about what you do annually for volunteers in terms of recognition. And finally, how are you going to follow up with staff? This isn't a one-off opportunity. You should be training ongoingly. I want to share another approach that became that we really developed in partnership with a couple large multi-level organizations in Canada and the US, when about 8 years ago, we had been developing curricula for training staff in volunteer engagement, 10-part series of 1-hour webinars, or quarterly convenings, 90 minutes each, or 2 full days in person. And a year or so after developing those with a couple different organizations, we had many of those leaders coming back to us and saying, could you take those 10 hours of trainings and break them into just 20-minute segments? Or could you take those, that 2 days that we did and make it so that our volunteer engagement specialists could just do it in 30 minutes while going to different department meetings? And what we found was that these organizations were wanting to integrate volunteer engagement training into existing meetings. And so we worked with them to develop what we call mini trainings. We define these as programs or interactions of 30 minutes or less. They focus on just one discrete topic. They might introduce one tool or practice. Follow-up is expected, and they often are part of a larger gathering, whether it be a department meeting or an all-staff meeting, or maybe even a retreat, but it is usually part of regular department meetings where the volunteer engagement professional goes to that department. So you're meeting people where they are. Here's an example from our friends down in Pasco County. She didn't call it a mini training, but it really was. It's a little short piece on volunteer onboarding. 9 slides that talk about where they recruit, steps to applying for the volunteer, what's on the application and survey, and what does success look like. You could find that you might want to develop a mini training on writing a position description, developing a recruitment method. Not all of these, just pick one. Behavioral interviewing, how to provide volunteer feedback, maybe a new function in the volunteer management system, the platform that you use. What is one discrete topic that you might be able to present that you know folks are wanting to know more about, and how can you integrate that into a larger convening, but with only a 20 or 30-minute program? Now, I'm the first to say it sometimes is a lot easier to develop a 1-hour training or a full day training for me than it is to narrow things down and prioritize and really curate the information so it only takes 20 to 30 minutes. It takes a lot of scripting and to do that. You don't necessarily have to script every word, but when I prepare for a 1-day workshop, and I've been training folks for decades, I can put a couple loose guidelines on my notes to know around what time I should be finishing things. When I'm doing a 50 or 60-minute webinar like this, I have timestamps written out on every part of my notes so that I can be making sure I'm not going off track and staying within the time limits. That's a challenge that even those of us who are most experienced still need to plan for. And that's why we developed this mini training guide, which is available from Better Impact for those who took this webinar. And this is a guide to help design mini training sessions that can be integrated into new employee orientations, department meetings, maybe even one-on-one coaching sessions. And we walk you through what you can do to identify the need, develop the session, and follow up, and even give you a template for an agenda that literally says, Your introduction should be 3 to 5 minutes. What are you going to talk about during that introduction? How can you introduce your content or your tool in just 5 to 10 minutes? What's a 5 to 10 minute activity that your folks can do? Maybe it's a role play. Maybe it's trying their hand at filling something out. Maybe it's answering a question or walking through a scenario. And then how are you going to wrap up in just 2 to 3 minutes? So I encourage you to play with a mini training session and pick a topic that's really pressing and try your hand at developing that. Whether you're doing a mini training or 2 full days or a 20-minute video that's on demand, it's really important to set expectations. And when I say setting expectations, I mean not just preparing yourself, also preparing your participants so they know what to expect. Preparing yourself might mean developing or gathering handouts or doing a tech check if you're recording it, reserving a space, doing all of those things. But don't overlook the chance to prepare your participants. Communicate the purpose, the topic, and how long it's going to take. Let them know that, or provide that language to their director so they can communicate that to their team and say, at next week's meeting, we're going to be visited by our volunteer engagement professional, and they're going to take 20 to 30 minutes of our meeting to talk about a new feature on our volunteer management software, and it's going to benefit you in this way, and it's going to be participatory, and they'll be available for questions. So engage their leadership in setting the stage and let them know if they're going to be follow-up expectations. Helping our participants know what their role is really, really important. Some of the best educators I've worked with trained me, taught me, and inspired me to make sure that our participants know what they're supposed to be doing. And the analogy that one of them uses is that sort of stereotypical, I don't know how often it really happens, but you see it in movies and on TV shows. You're at a restaurant with someone and a violinist comes to play at your table. And one of the reasons that that feels so uncomfortable to many of us as we even imagine that is we don't know what we're supposed to do during that. Do we watch the violinist? Do we keep eating? Do we just look lovingly at the person we came with? We don't know what our role is. And the last thing you want is to put your participants in that space of being uncomfortable and not knowing what their role is or what they should be doing. So as you provide training to your colleagues, let them know, I'm going to talk for a couple minutes. I can field questions throughout, or we'll save questions for the end. And I'm going to be asking you to pair up and talk through something with your colleagues. And then we will come back together and regroup. You know, giving them that navigation can really put everyone at ease. The last thing I want to share before we kind of take this home is the opportunity to be prepared for the unexpected moment. How often do we see a staff member doing or saying something or handling something in a way that we think they could be doing better or learning from that opportunity? And that's what I think of as the teachable moments. It's really difficult for us to be ready and know exactly what to say in those moments if we haven't prepared. And my guess is you could, even just sitting here while watching this and listening, think of a couple of different scenarios where you commonly see or hear about staff, colleagues, or volunteer leaders doing something that you wish you could tune in and say the right thing in that particular moment. You might not need a 30-minute or 2-hour workshop around it. You just need 5 minutes. And we can prepare for that. You can prepare a series of 5-minute minis, as I like to call them, where you're ready to share one tip. Maybe it's on how to give volunteer feedback. Maybe it's about how to coach a volunteer to handle something differently or in a different way. What's the one tip? Make sure that you ask them for ideas about how they could handle it differently. We like to call that feed forward, not just feedback, but ask them to feed forward. How might you do it differently next time? And then follow up with an email later with some additional resources and learning opportunities. What are those things that you tend to see, and how can you prepare and even rehearse 5-minute mini that you can be prepared when the opportunity arises to say to the person, hey, I saw that you were just, having trying to work with a frustrated volunteer, or you seemed frustrated by that interaction. I'd love to talk to you when you have 5 minutes later today, or maybe we can move to my office right now and talk for 5 minutes. I'd love to share a tip, see if you have any additional thoughts, and then let you get on with the rest of your day. But it helps if we have those kind of prepared and in our back pocket and ready to go. And finally, whether you're doing a 5-minute mini, or a mini training, or a larger initiative, the point is it's time to implement and follow up. Remember, you set the tone. You can do so with energy. Have a plan and follow it, with the one caveat that if you find that they really have a different question that's more pressing and they're not going to be able to attend to your question, your topic, without first handling that, maybe you need to pivot, but hopefully you won't need to do that. And then afterwards, note what went well and what you might do differently, and then plan to follow up. Thank the staff contact for the opportunity to facilitate the session or to have that 5-minute coaching session. Email participants to request feedback or offer some additional questions. Maybe 2 to 3 weeks post-training, reach back out and see if they've had a chance to use anything that they've learned, if they have any other ideas for additional mini trainings. Maybe survey participants to gather feedback or input, as I said, on additional topics. So implement it and follow up. As you move forward and think about your key takeaways from today, I'd really encourage you to think about, what topics do your colleagues need training on? And with that in mind, what would be your big idea? Which format or formats would be appropriate? And what steps can you take to make that happen? Do you need to make the case? Or do you already have everyone on board? And if so, how can you then just begin to look at some creative ways to build your colleagues' capacity to engage volunteers impactfully? Take a moment and write down your aha moments from today and work those into a plan. Because a goal without a plan is just a wish, and it's on your shoulders, and it's your opportunity to embrace your role, to be a partner, an internal consultant to your colleagues. Make a plan to do so. Think about what would success be and get started. You don't have to overhaul the entire continuing education or human resources training program. You can start small and celebrate those successes along the way. We at VQ Volunteer Strategies and our wonderful partners at Better Impact have lots and lots of resources to help you, and we hope that you'll reach out to your colleagues as well. I wish you great success, and go forth and engage. Thank you so much.